Well, hello. Here we're going to be continuing our discussion of free will. First, we looked at Descartes' view. This time around, we're going to be spending some time with Thomas Hobbes, who offers a different perspective. Hobbes and Descartes were around at the same time, and in fact, when Descartes published the Meditations, he then sent them around to learned people around Europe who offered their objections, and then Descartes gave his replies to those objections. Hobbes and Descartes have a discussion in the fourth set of objections and replies. And just by reading it, you can kind of tell that they didn't really like each other. And they came at philosophical questions with rather different approaches. So, with that in mind, let's think about how Hobbes' very different approach to philosophy gives us a different way of thinking about free will. So part of how Hobbes approaches the question of liberty and necessity, and we're looking at a short version of that, just a little excerpt out of this anthology, Early Modern Philosophy, an anthology edited by Shapiro and Lascano. We're going to find a different approach. And part of how Hobbes takes this approach is he says, first we're just going to come in and we're going to define our terms. Here's what we mean when we say different words like liberty, necessity, will. So, within the course of about a page, Hobbes gets all of his main concepts out. So he's going to say, for instance, you're doing something voluntarily if you're acting in a way that follows your appetite. Right? So if I take a sip of my drink, we might say, I just followed my appetite. It's not like somebody made me drink. So we would say that was a voluntary instance of drinking. Right? And we might also say it could be a spontaneous action given that it's done based on choice or election. Hobbes also defines the will for us. He says, the will is simply your last appetite in deliberation. Have you ever heard the saying, like, if it be your will, then go ahead and do it? Well, basically what that's saying is, if that's what you want, right? And Hobbes is going to say, well, it's not like any desire you have is your will, but your will is, after you consider all your options and you think about what's going to be best for you and what you want most, that's the desire that wins out. That's what your will is. So quite a different definition than we saw in Descartes' Meditations, where Descartes told us that the will is this power to do or not do, which is undetermined by external forces. Now, he suggests that acting from election and voluntariness and freedom are all basically the same kinds of categories. And within this context, he's also going to say, when we're talking about voluntary or free actions, that's based on your desires. And to have liberty of action, or to have liberty as a person, is to act from ends that are intrinsic, right? So it's the idea that, look, if you are acting on the basis of your own desires, then that's what it is to have liberty. And within Hobbes' picture of how people work, he's going to say, look, it's absurd to think that desires come from nowhere, that they just are these magical things separate from the laws of nature. In fact, he's going to say, look, your desires come from somewhere. They come from the outside, right? They come from nature and nurture, as it were. Your heredity, your sort of internal, innate tendencies, plus the experiences that you have. That's nature and nurture. And he's going to say, look, the reason why you want the things that you want is because of certain natural explanations. Here's a further point. Sufficient causes necessitate their results. So here Hobbes is basically saying everything that happens has to happen. A sufficient cause basically just means enough to bring this thing about, right? So if I say that doghood is sufficient for mammalhood, what I'm saying is that being a dog is enough to guarantee that we've got a mammal, right? So we would say that, like, look, sufficient just means enough. And we say, like, look, if doghood is enough for mammalhood, we can also say that it's being enough guarantees us a certain result, right? So doghood guarantees, having a dog in the room guarantees you are having a mammal in the room, right? So sufficient causes necessitate their results. Now, Hobbes gives us a couple of arguments for this. One is he gives the example of throwing a dice. He said, if you throw a dice and you get AMBSACE, AMBSCACE, AMBSACE, which basically means the lowest possible roll on a die. So a 1 or snake eyes with 2 dice, with 2 dice. Now, he's going to say, in this case, if you roll that die, there is a certain series of reasons that will explain why it had to come up on a certain number. And it's going to be things like the spin, the hardness of the table, and the angles, right? So I've actually got a die here with me. Let's turn it down towards my desk here. And we're going to say, like, look, I'm going to roll the die. This time it came up a 5. Well, what are we going to say about this situation? Well, we could say that, for instance, I was holding it in my hand in a certain way. I threw it with a certain aggressiveness or lack of aggressiveness, and so on and so forth. That basically, every time I threw it with that starting grip, with that spin, onto a table this hard, and so on and so forth, it's always going to come up a 5. That's Hobbes' thought, right? So if it was enough to bring about a 5 on that example, if we were to do things exactly the same every single time, we would always get 5s, right? So basically everything that happens in nature is going to have an explanation, and a series of explanations that are always going to necessitate those effects. Here's a second argument that Hobbes gives us. He says, let the case be put, for example, of the weather. It is necessary that tomorrow it shall rain or not rain. If therefore it be not necessary it shall rain, it is necessary it shall not rain. Otherwise there is no necessity in that the proposition it shall rain or not rain should be true. So he's saying it's 100% guaranteed true that it's not going to rain or it's going to rain, right? That's 100% guaranteed. But if there's any possibility that it won't rain, then it's 100% sure that it will rain. And if it's 100% sure that it and if there's any possibility of it not being necessary it rains, then it will be necessary that it won't, right? Now, part of how we might interpret this argument is that this is just a very bad argument, right? We might say that it might be like 60-40. It's not necessary that it will rain, it's not necessary that it won't. It's like a 60-40 split, right? Now, Hobbes is going to say that that's about like our own perspectives on things. Ultimately, one way or another, it's gonna rain or it's not gonna rain. And if there's no guarantee that it won't rain, then it definitely will. Because we might think that the only things that would make it the case that it might not rain are the conditions that would be sufficient to necessitate the fact that it will. Maybe that's the nice way of going at this argument. In any case, you can go back to page 83 of the text, look this over. He also mentions the possibility of an objection and says, look, I'm not talking about our own personal perspectives, I'm talking about the facts. And if something doesn't have to happen, then it won't. So maybe this is a good argument, maybe this is a bad argument. The main thing to notice is we can ask questions about Hobbes' view that everything that ever happens is going to happen. So that's really the more important question about Hobbes, not whether he had a good argument for the deterministic nature of the universe. The more important thing about Hobbes is whether he can make liberty and necessity compatible. And here's how Hobbes continues this line of thought. He says, "There is no such thing as an agent which, when all things requisite to action are present, can nevertheless forbear to produce it, or which is all one, that there is no such thing as freedom from necessity." So there you might think that Hobbes doesn't believe in free will, right? He says everything you do, you're gonna have to do, right? But what he's saying there is that there's no such thing as freedom from necessity, right? But he also seems to point out, and we'll notice here, right? He says there are agents, right? He says if there be an agent, it can work, and if it work, there be nothing wanting what is requisite to produce the action, and consequently the action is sufficient, and if sufficient, also necessary. So he's saying there is this thing called human action. He's just also going to say that there are certain things that are going to necessitate certain actions. So when I got out of bed and made a pot of coffee this morning, well, we would say that, look, my habits and my desire for coffee was enough to guarantee that I was going to do exactly what I did. Just get out of bed, boil the water, grind the beans, and make the coffee. Right? So there he's going to say, look, we have people acting and making decisions, but the causes of these actions and decisions are not free from necessity. But Hobbes still thinks that people have wills, right? Because a will is just the last appetite of deliberation, and people can still be at liberty. Because as was the case with my making a pot of coffee this morning, nobody stopped me, right? Nobody came into my house and stole my coffee beans. Nobody locked me out of my kitchen. And in that way, we could say, look, because I was able to act on my will, I freely made a pot of coffee this morning. Hobbes also says, if you are not a determinist, that's going to lead to theological problems. He says, God knows that which he decrees and foreknows. Right? Now, if you take the Descartes view, which says that you have a genuine power to do or not do, and your actions are determined by no outside force, then there is no fact about the future. And if there is no fact about the future, then God doesn't know anything about the future. Right? That seems, at least according to Hobbes, a drawback of his theory. He thinks that he can give more glory to God by giving God the knowledge of how you're going to act in the future. But in spite of maybe some of the theoretical benefits, glorifying God by giving him more knowledge, or by making human action an intelligible part of the natural world and natural sciences, it seems to me at least that Hobbes' version of freedom of the will, free action, is less suited to solve Descartes' problem of error. Right? The problem of error is just like, look, people make mistakes. Why do they make mistakes? Well, they use their free will irresponsibly, and they could have not made the mistake. Hobbes cannot say that. Right? Hobbes cannot say you could have done otherwise. Right? So Hobbes would say, when you decide to let your intellect outrun your will, as Descartes is thinking about it, you are not free from the necessity of the fact that you are going to do that. And that might be a certain theoretical cost for Hobbes. Or maybe Hobbes would be willing to, as they say in philosophy, bite the bullet and say, yeah, we cannot say that there is a better possible world where you made a better possible choice. So in that case, we might think that Hobbes' version of free will, at least, is not as adequate to develop a theodicy for the problem of unnecessary suffering, or a theodicy for Descartes' problem of error. Let's contextualize Hobbes' view just a little bit. I went over these concepts in the Descartes video as well. We remember there's determinism. Everything that ever happens had to happen. Not the same view as fatalism, right? It's not that you shouldn't bother trying because there are certain things that the gods have just made it such that they're going to happen no matter what you try, right? So, like, Hobbes is going to say, look, you trying things and doing things, that's part of nature. And it's not like there are certain things that are fated in the future in spite of your trying, right? But we will notice that Hobbes is a determinist, right? So everything that happens is a thing that happens necessarily. Hobbes would assert that, though Descartes would deny it. Compatibilism, right? This is the question, if the universe is deterministic, is there free will or free action? Well, we noticed for Hobbes, yeah, everything that happens has to happen, he thinks. But he also thinks that there's still such thing as liberty of action. So in fact, Hobbes is going to live right here with compatibilism. Whereas Descartes is going to say, if you didn't truly have the power to do otherwise, then free will and free action would be impossible. So neither Hobbes nor Descartes are free will deniers. That is, neither of them are hard determinists who say, look, the universe is deterministic, so there is no such thing as free will. The way to think about it is that Descartes is a libertarian who thinks that we have free will on the basis of his belief that some of our actions are not determined, whereas Hobbes is going to believe that we do have free will, even though everything we ever do is determined or necessitated. So just go back to one of the quotes we looked at. There is no such thing as an agent, which when all things requisite to action are present, can nevertheless forbear to produce it. So it's impossible to forbear when all the sufficient causes of your action are in place. So everything that you're going to do, you're going to have to do, according to Hobbes. So you don't have freedom from necessity, right? The laws of nature are coming for you, whether you like it or not, right? But in spite of that, he still thinks that there is such a thing called action and agents and wills, right? So which view does Hobbes fit with? Well, just to recap, he thinks that determinism is true. Everything that happens has to happen, right? He doesn't believe in freedom from necessity. That's another way of saying, like, look, everything that happens has to happen. But he does think that we can still use the word freedom or liberty meaningfully when we talk about actions, that is, things that human beings and people do within a deterministic universe. So because he thinks that we can have both determinism and free actions, that's going to make him a compatibilist, right? Free will, or at least free action, is something that we can talk about even in that deterministic universe. So, with this video and the previous one, we've gotten both Descartes' view and Hobbes's competing view of free will on the table. And I will leave it to you to reflect on who's got a better way of thinking about, say, the nature of the will and the nature of freedom. And with that in mind, you've got some reflection to do about the question of who was right. So thanks as always for listening, and I'll look forward to being in touch next time. Take care.